So today I am bringing you a video essay on a topic I have wanted to talk about for so long, and it's really about the sanitization of various revolutionary figures. And in this video I am going to primarily focus on Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King Jr. Now before we get into the video, if you guys like my content, maybe like the video and subscribe, as that does help me out a lot. And if you really like it, maybe consider supporting me on Patreon. And once again, I thank everyone who has already done so. So with that all out the way, let's get into this video. You might know Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela through the I Have a Dream speech, or Free Nelson Mandela, you know, that popular song when he was in prison. But I feel this sort of mythology around them is really detrimental to what the overall message was. So let's get into the video essay. Before we dissect this issue, we must frame my argument. I find that Lenin's assessment of what happened to Marx is perfect in helping my analysis of what has happened to people like Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. So in 1917, Lenin wrote, "What is now happening to Marx's theory has, in the course of history, happened repeatedly to the theories of revolutionary thinkers and leaders of oppressed classes fighting for emancipation. During the lifetime of great revolutionaries, the oppressing classes constantly hounded them, received their theories with the most savage malice, the most furious hatred, and the most unscrupulous campaigns of lies and slander. After their death, attempts are made to convert them into harmless icons, to canonize them, so to say, and to hallow their names to a certain extent for the consolation of the oppressed classes, and with the object of duping the latter, while at the same time robbing the revolutionary theory of its substance, blunting its revolutionary edge, and vulgarizing it. Today, the bourgeoisie and the opportunists within the labour movement concur in this doctrine of Marxism. They omit, obscure, or distort the revolutionary side of this theory, its revolutionary soul. They push to the foreground and extol what is or seems acceptable to the bourgeoisie. All the social chauvinists are now Marxists, and more frequently German bourgeois scholars, only yesterday specialists in the annihilation of Marxism, are speaking of the national German, Marx, who, they claim, educated the labour unions, which are so splendidly organised for the purpose of waging a predatory war. This Lenin quote succinctly sums up how many of the world's most celebrated figures had been sanitised beyond all recognition. Although they are celebrated, as Lenin describes Marx as being, the core of their message is often ignored. We can see this across many figures throughout history. Marx is obviously one. Sanitized and mischaracterized in that he is either a man who advocated for free government handouts for everyone so no one had to work, or the father of an evil genocidal ideology that gave the world Stalin's gulags or Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution. But Lenin was right. In his time, Marx was reviled by many, but decades after his death, he was created into something new. Today in 2019, he is widely praised at the very least for his critique of the capitalist system. Despite the constant smears of Marx and the numerous attempts to link him to authoritarianism, Marx's true message won't die. I'd say out of the many revolutionary figures, he is one of the luckier ones, where a lot of his true self has lasted over the decades after he has passed on. However, this cannot be said for two other revolutionaries, namely Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela. Both have been sanitized beyond recognition of their core message. It has been distilled, simplified, and then spread to the masses. Take Dr. King. King is now celebrated by Republicans and Democrats alike as a man who died fighting for racial equality. This even seems fairly apolitical, and it also lacks any nuance. King even has a national holiday named after him. His characterization by mainstream America fails to discuss what King's philosophy was firmly steeped in.
We read one day, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if a man doesn't have a job or an income, he has neither life nor liberty and the possibility for the pursuit of happiness. He merely exists."
It is ironic a man like Ted Cruz can go on a tweeting spree about how much he respects King, despite the fact Cruz is the exact type of man King would have fought and would be one he would have despised. But as Lenin says, the US has made King into a harmless icon. In particular, I want to discuss how a key component of King's fight for racial equality was his fight against capitalism. This is evident throughout his life. In 1952, he wrote to his wife that, "I imagine you already know how much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic I am." Capitalism started out with a noble and high motive, but like most human systems, it fell victim to the very thing it was revolting against. So today, capitalism has outlived its usefulness. In 1966, King addressed his understanding of capitalism, saying that we are saying that something is wrong with capitalism, there must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move towards democratic socialism. Call it what you may, call it democracy, call it democratic socialism, but there must be a better distribution of wealth within this country for all God's children. King's anti-capitalism as part of his general revolutionary views can be seen in a report to the SCLC staff in May 1967. We must recognise that we can't solve our problem now until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. This means a revolution of values and other things. We must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation and militarism are all tied together. You can't really get rid of one without getting rid of the others. Now, if you have ever been taught about Martin Luther King Jr. in school, ask yourself this. Do these quotes seem like something you would have been taught? Were you taught about how King was an anti-capitalist as well as an anti-racist? Did it tell you how he felt that the economic exploitation of capitalism was inherently linked to racism? If you received a similar primary and secondary school education to me, you would not have been taught these things. From King's quotes on capitalism to his quotes on the Vietnam War, in which he compared the US actions to the Nazis, there is no way any right-winger or self-described capitalist would be a fan of King, but somehow he is widely respected across politics in America. It is clear this is all because the idea of King has been taught wrong. The elite have completely distorted his revolutionary message and replaced it with something more apolitical and mundane. He's someone most Americans can support without too much trouble. It is clear the people in power realise that King was larger than life. He was not going to be ever forgotten in the United States. So how did they destroy King? They completely omitted most of his important messages and replaced him with a sanitized version. This way they have successfully sanitized a figure who could be far more dangerous in death if his message had consistently been taught in the mainstream. King is probably the best example of what Lenin describes, but someone else who has seen a similar thing happen to him in death is Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was globally celebrated for his fight against apartheid South Africa. He was celebrated by the same politicians and peoples who had supported the apartheid regime. His 27-year sentence he served in prison for his activism captured the imagination of people around the world. In his post-prison political career, he was less of a revolutionary, as he attempted to guide a struggle in South Africa into the 21st century. Just like King, Mandela has been sanitized, and a main component of this is that his sympathy to socialism is largely omitted. As a young man, he had close ties to the South African Communist Party, and was inspired to plot an armed uprising after seeing the success of the Castro brothers and Che Guevara in Cuba. A veteran anti-apartheid campaigner and a friend of Mandela's said, he came out of prison a senior statesman in waiting, he went into prison a militant revolutionary leader. He was a burly freedom fighter, learning how to shoot in Ethiopia and travelling to revolutionary Algeria and other countries while he was underground. We must never forget he was a freedom fighter. Stephen Ellis, a professor of African history at VU University and the African Studies Centre in the Netherlands, has pointed out how misinterpreted Mandela has been, and his book, External Mission, the ANC in Exile, shows this. Ellis said, if you talk to many American liberals, they think Mandela was Martin Luther King. If you say, no, Mandela started a guerrilla army, he was a communist, he did this, he did that, they just don't get it. They just don't know what you are talking about. As I previously stated, the Cuban Revolution was one that held the highest place in Mandela's heart, and he became close friends with Fidel Castro after his release. When he visited Cuba in 1991, he paid tribute to Che Guevara, calling his exploits too powerful for any prison consorts to hide from us. This life of Che is an inspiration to all human beings who cherish freedom. Mandela was left behind by many of his contemporaries as South Africa's left moved away from socialism. In a speech after his release, he said the ANC were committed to nationalising the banks, the mines and industries at a time when free market economics was sweeping all before it. And this was greeted with horror by most of the ANC and South Africa in general. Mandela was very pro-Soviet when he went into prison, but the world had left him behind when he had got out. So much so that ANC steered him away from government and party affairs even when he became president, and used him to unify the ANC and South Africa instead, and he became more like a figurehead. But even after leaving office in 1999, Mandela still committed to his original beliefs. He savaged Blair and Bush for the Iraq War, saying, "If there is a country that has committed unspeakable atrocities in the world, it is the United States of America." Mandela was a militant, anti-colonial, anti-racist socialist who was far more ideologically in line with Fidel Castro than the West. But again, how is he remembered? What is his legacy? What are we taught in schools? Ellis makes a great point. We are taught both Mandela and Martin Luther King are birds of a feather. They are both seen as more pacifistic figures whose only clear motivation was to unite their countries and make them equal for all races. And these myths have successfully become the knowledge of these two men. It is why they have become so universally praised and respected, because if we look into what they actually stood for, there is no way they would have this popularity, especially in the West. King was a radical anti-capitalist who saw capitalism as a major part of the system of racism that white Americans had economically thrived on for centuries. Mandela was a militant socialist who wanted a Cuba-style revolution to overthrow the apartheid regime. This is a far cry from how these men are presented, where zealous, racist right-wingers like Ted Cruz can publicly show his respect for people like them. These figures were larger than life and are titans of modern history, and as I previously said, they cannot be forgotten. So instead of trying to purge their memory, their previous tormentors has successfully morphed their legacy into something harmless, apolitical and vague. These men are presented as anti-racist in the most bare bones and simplest of terms. They are largely uncontroversial to the average person, despite in reality being deeply controversial in their challenge to the status quo. With the access to the internet, hopefully more can educate themselves on the true thoughts and words of Marx, King and Mandela, and understand what they were really fighting for. It is a time to reclaim revolutionary figures like this from the bourgeois, from people who want nothing more than to assimilate them into polite society, to adopt them for their own ends and exploitation. So that concludes the video essay. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. There are plenty of other figures who have received the same treatment as Marx, as people like Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. Let me know in the comments some of the worst ones. I was thinking about putting Gandhi in this video, but I thought I'd stick to Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. If you like the video, please leave a like, maybe subscribe to the channel. If you want to follow me on social media, follow me at The Tabernacle on both Twitter and Instagram. I also have a WordPress blog and the link is just in the description. Like I said at the start of the video, I also have a Patreon now, so please go check that out. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.